Hello, everyone. My name is Brianna Alba, and welcome to the Founder Palace podcast. We are a podcast with a mission to spread the stories of student founders and hopefully inspire other students in these positions. And today we have with us a very special student founder. His name is
Zane Sabbagh.
and we're going to allow him to give us a little bit of an intro to himself. So why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so former Stanford student. I was studying symbolic systems and master's in computer science. I took a leave last spring to try a couple different ideas I had around applying unorthodox ways and methods to improve mental health for Gen Z.
Great, thank you. And so, your app, do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so right now, Can is pretty focused around reflection. Every day, at a time, like at a certain moment, we release a time-sensitive prompt for people to respond to. Sometimes it's a photo, sometimes it's some other piece of data on their phone, but it's just a short video that they respond with, talking about whatever it is in a funny way. But it just really makes room for even like 30 seconds of reflection on a daily basis.
And so, what inspired you to start Candid?
So, like a lot of people, I struggled pretty deeply with my mental health in high school, and I grew up in Uzbekistan and Thailand, so I was pretty far removed from the whole like American therapy bubble. So I started journaling from a pretty young age, around 17. I tried to make it stick a couple times, and it didn't work because it's a pretty hard habit to form. So the idea with Candid was like, how can we make journaling accessible and easy to people? And even if it seems very abridged now, I think the very act of taking a few seconds from your day to think about your life is very beneficial for someone's mental health.
And so, what would you say really got you started into thinking of, or I know you said you struggled a lot with your mental health when you were growing up, but what was the point that really inspired you to say, I'm gonna look for solutions to help other people who were in my position?
Actually, one night I was coming back from section leading at Stanford. It was like 11. That's kind of when I get into my creative journaling mode. So I was just journaling as I always do in Notion, and it struck me for the first time that I wanted to go back through my Notion. I realized how much growth I'd had in the last year and how beneficial it was to me. And I just looked back at the moments, at the times in my journal where there were like lapses in when I journaled, and I remembered how bad my mental health had been at those times. And I realized that, great, I'd started this habit. It was a pretty hard habit to start, and noticed a lot of my friends that could have definitely benefited from them from starting the habit, and a few that had. And I just thought to myself, how can I make this compelling? And after doing a lot of research, I think, like most interventions in life, things are easier when you have some sort of social reason to do it. So you look at studies where people try to start the habit of running. If they have a running buddy, they're almost twice as likely to do it. So we wanted to take that and apply it to Candid.
And so, how did you go about creating the app? Like, what gave you the idea to start an app, for example, and not create a journal or something else like that?
I think when you're looking at entrepreneurship, especially consumer entrepreneurship, you want to try to get things into people's lives with the lowest investment effort possible. And I think doing something that's an app really enables pretty much the whole world to get on board with it, as long as they have some sort of smartphone.
And did you ever have any experience building apps or working with apps previous to Candid?
Yeah, so I'd had actually zero experience doing any sort of development, any sort of entrepreneurial project, honestly, before Candid. So I really took off my sophomore summer to just work full time on Candid and kind of understanding the entrepreneurial ecosystem.
And so, do you want to speak a little bit as to how that process was for you, learning about entrepreneurship, learning how to build your app, and how that was going?
I think the first few months were very tough just because I didn't really know anything. And when you don't know anything, you don't really know where to start either. I was doing a lot of research, watching a lot of YouTube on, creating your first Xcode project, really trying to understand the world of front end development. Before Stanford, I'd never written a line of code. So I fully learned to code in Python, C++ here in 106A and B. Yeah, the first summer it was mostly learning to code and reaching out to people. So we were sending hundreds of emails throughout the summer, and we didn't really have much beyond an idea. In the end, it worked well. So what we did is we went door to door in the computer science building and the psychology buildings, because those are the places where we needed mentors. And after about 50 knocks, we got our first two mentors. And I think from there things were a lot easier because people at Stanford know other people at Stanford, and the circle gets very much wider from there.
And so, how did your mentors really help motivate you or help open doors for you?
One of our mentors, Johannes, he's now an official advisor to the company, but he was very receptive from day one, which is something Matthew and I didn't expect. We sent him an email after knocking on his office door to no avail, and he answered us back with an invite to Slack and the Slack message talking about how he was in the Himalayas, but then he sent about 10 minutes worth of feedback to us, even though
Oh
he was
wow.
on vacation
Yeah.
backpacking in the Himalayas, which was just a pretty amazing thing for us. That on its own was a lot of inspiration. Like,
Mhm.
hey, somebody that knows a lot about psychology thinks this idea has merit and
Mhm.
thinks this idea is like worth his time,
Mhm.
when most professors at Stanford are already incredibly busy. So I think getting his continuous feedback on like the psychology aspect of the thing was amazing. In terms of opening doors, the more people you talk to at Stanford, the more people you'll get to know. It's really incredible how small the world of the entrepreneurial ecosystem here is.
That must have been really fulfilling to hear that, your idea had merit, like how
Yeah.
you were saying. So you said you took off the summer to really like get into this idea and start building. When you came back to Stanford, how did it feel to have to balance both sides of work and then schoolwork?
Yeah, so it was honestly incredibly stressful. I was on, essentially full financial aid. So I was working as an RA and as a section leader and trying to do this and trying to do school. So I think that fall was probably the busiest time of my life. And it was just really frustrating because I didn't really feel like I was getting anything done right, especially school. And I think that really motivated the decision to take a leave in the spring because I didn't feel like I was getting a chance to do anything in my life to its fullest. And I was like, being at Stanford's a very, special opportunity,
Mhm.
and it sort of feels like I'm wasting it by not being very present while I'm building this company out.
And do you plan to come back to Stanford eventually?
Yeah, absolutely. My mom would kill me if I didn't get the degree. So
You don't have to speak any details into this, but do you currently have any future projects or ideas that you're either thinking of or actually creating right now?
yeah, I think one of the biggest lessons in entrepreneurship is to never stay too focused. I think if you read Innovators by Walter Isaacson, and it talks about the entire evolution of computer science and the internet and technology, the digital revolution. It consistently talks about how all the best entrepreneurs, their greatest ideas really came as side projects from their main idea,
Oh,
or like at
interesting.
least the greatest iterations of those projects
Mhm.
came from side ideas or things that they've been exposed to and were thinking about. So that's a big motivator for me. I write down an idea probably at least once a week in
Oh
my
wow.
journal. If I'm still thinking about it a week later, I'll start actually taking action. But yeah, right now, my friend, my co-founder Matthew and I, we're also working on, it's kind of like little side project, a journal app
Mhm.
that's I think very also non-traditional, and it's very different to Canada. It's more of like a personal use type of thing, but I think it's very different to the existing apps on the marketplace right now.
And I can only imagine this whole process of building your app and coming up with these ideas is not very linear. I'm sure there's setbacks and obstacles you've come to face. So can you speak a little bit as to some of the obstacles you faced along your journey?
I mean, we've really faced lots of obstacles. I think just thinking back to last fall, sometimes it was a pretty demotivating time. When you're first learning to code, everything feels impossible. Getting a couple pages of the app's work feels so frustrating. Now it's a lot easier with ChatGPT and things like that, but it still can be frustrating. And I think even when you do get things to work, you don't necessarily understand the why. So just feeling, a large sense of imposter syndrome constantly is another big thing. I think Matthew and I are not we didn't really have a traditional path to being student founders. Both of us were doing econ research up until starting Candid. Neither of us had any tech internships, anything like that. We knew essentially nothing about how companies work. So there was a lot more ground to cover in terms of learning. I think one of the obstacles that created for us is when we go and apply for all these different accelerator programs very early on when the idea was just an idea. It was hard for people to believe that we'd actually go and execute on that idea. I think we applied to like 60 different programs, honestly. I have like an Excel spreadsheet of all of them, and we got rejected by essentially every single one.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I think that was something that was a big, big learning experience. I think most Stanford students don't really know what it feels like to receive 60 rejections in a row.
Yeah.
It's quite a humbling experience. But I'm very, very grateful to have had that experience because I think learning to see the idea beyond the value other people see in it is an absolutely essential trait for entrepreneurs to have.
Yeah, I agree. That must have been really hard. So what motivated you to keep going and keep pushing?
Yeah, I think this deep and relentless belief that even if it wasn't in the shape or product that we were working on at the time, the whole idea that you could make journaling social in some sense was going to be very impactful one day. This piece of advice that I always try to keep in mind when I have doubts in what I'm doing is the advice of Tim Ferriss, which is to focus on spaces that you know that you really see could have a massive impact in the future, and then just be relentless about ensuring that those spaces progress. I think one example Tim Ferriss gives is that he was looking at psychedelics and funding psychedelics research maybe 15 years ago, and regardless of your opinion on psychedelics, it's hard to say that it hasn't really flourished in the last 15 years. And at one point, he was a major percentage of the entire funding going into that industry because he was trying to advance it for himself. And because there's not much work going into that industry as a whole, there's not really much likewise there's not much research going on in the journaling space. Working on that space has a disproportionate impact in the long term.
And so, what are some of your long-term goals for Candid?
I mean, I definitely think we want to cross the million user threshold in the next 2 years. That's a little bit of an audacious goal, but it's one we really
Really
believe
want to
in.
reach?
Yeah.
So, in your role as a student founder, what would you say have been, what kind of support or resources have been the most important in your journey?
Yeah, I think other students has to be the number one thing that's helped us. I remember the first time I was truly in like a very collaborative entrepreneurial environment. It was a retreat sponsored by Contrary Capital with 12 other student founders, and I remember we had like a little bit of like a co-hacking session where everybody was working on their different projects. I remember being so inspired by how much progress everybody else in the room was able to make, like technically on a project within the span of a day. I really think that completely like just swept the bar of how fast I thought I needed to be working on something. And it also gave me this community of people that I could go and ask for technical advice whenever I needed it. It was a very non-judgmental community, and I think that's a very big misconception about entrepreneurship, is that you need to know everything, and that asking really dumb questions is somehow bad, or at least you should be ashamed of doing it. But most people are very keen on helping you.
And I think to build off on that, I believe a lot of students who aren't student founders but are probably, or maybe have an idea and want to get into this field, are often afraid to get into it for those exact same reasons. So, what would you say are some big misconceptions that you had to unlearn when you became a student founder?
Yeah, I think seeking validation instead of spending time on your product is the absolute number one thing. I thought that to really make it work, we needed to get into some sort of program. Now, having been in 3 different ones, I absolutely feel that we should have spent a lot more time actually working and testing the product very early. Another really big one is that the first time we were shipping the product, and we really sparsely spoke to the people actually using the product, which was a massive mistake because we were just so overwhelmed with building the product. And consequently, that caused us to build a lot of things that we didn't need in the app and remove them, right? So
Okay.
always, and very often speak to the people actually using. Just get the, and it's so cliche, but always seek to get the simplest version of your product out first. If you need to build an everything app to get somebody to use it, it might not be as compelling of an app as you think.
I know you spoke that it was really hard for you guys to, you applied to a lot of programs and it was really humbling to get all of those rejections. Can you speak as to how it felt when you finally got your first investor, or how you got your first investor?
Yeah. So winter quarter, we decided to go start raising. It was a little bit of a frustrating time because we'd be on so many calls all the time, skipping class, and nobody will ever tell you no. I think that's the most frustrating thing, because most people believe that, oh, you're a Stanford student, in the long term you're going to have some sort of company. I want to build that relationship. I want to make it work. Nobody ever gives you a hard no. It's always come back later. But if you're talking to an investor and they tell you, oh, we know you're early, but you don't really have enough traction for this to make it work. I mean, I would say they don't really believe in your idea, and to take that as a no. I guess the way we did get funding is we went to this demo day hosted by friends and family at Stanford, so like entrepreneurial organization here. We didn't really know that there would be VCs. We'd actually just wanted to get people to test out the product. So we gave like a short 1 minute and 30 second pitch, which was very basic. We just kind of like went through our Figma a little bit. It's still on YouTube, and then it was crazy. So two people in the audience came up to us afterwards and talked to us, and we didn't realize that either of those people were investors. And then two more DM'd us because the thing had gone on Twitter, and they'd found our LinkedIn's and DM'd us. And all four of those people from friends and family actually ended up investing in us. Yeah, the first investor we got, Matthew and I were both sitting at Coupa with him. We didn't really know he was an investor because he's really young, and we thought he could be a student. And then he offered to write the check at that moment while we were sitting at Coupa, after we talked about the product and our stories for like 15 minutes, which was insane. So I think the big takeaway is when people like what you're doing, they'll move very fast.
That's so interesting, because I feel like you were seeking out so many investors this whole time, and then the ones who really made that impact they seem to find you instead.
Yeah. I think that's a very beautiful thing about Stanford. if you immerse yourself in a lot of these spaces, you will get a lot of inbound investment, which is nice.
And so, speaking again, or going back to a lot of the misconceptions that students have about becoming a student founder or trying to enter the space of entrepreneurship, in terms of investors, what is some misconceptions you had about them or how that whole process worked?
One thing that I thought would happen and didn't is if you send a bunch of emails from your Stanford email to all these investors, and I expected that every single one of them would reply and be super ecstatic to go and talk to us about the product, which maybe was a little bit naive. And especially if you don't have this crazy impressive resume when it comes to entrepreneurship and building, that probably won't happen. Don't expect to get too many replies. Concentrate. I would say people should concentrate their effort on getting warm introductions, basically being introduced to a VC by somebody else who has some sort of relation to that VC. Either they've pitched them previously, they know somebody at the VC, and that sounds hard, but it's not that hard. And you just go to LinkedIn, find any mutuals you have, like any seconds, and I think it's a very effective way of getting to know people that you'd really like to get to know.
And so, just switching gears a little bit, how would you say your journey as a student founder has evolved from when you were first starting to what you're doing now?
I think the main thing for me is taking what I think I know with a very, very big grain of salt. Even if you have this great idea or you think you have this great idea, you need to know who's going to use it. And ultimately, the most learning you can get is from whether they use it or not, and what they like about it or not. So pay attention to your user feedback a lot more than you pay attention to just your own ideas. Your ideas are starting points, but they really should be guided by how people use what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for sharing everything that you shared. I definitely feel a lot more educated on entrepreneurship and student founders and inspired. Your story is really interesting. But just as like one final question or one final thought, do you have anything you want to share with any potential student founders who are watching this, or just anything in general?
Yeah, I think get mentors and be very ambitious about who you try to get as a mentor. So for me, somebody that's really impacted my entrepreneurial journey so far is Mark Gainey, the guy that founded Strava. The way that I got to know him is through a series of introductions along people that worked at Strava. So I talked to one guy who introduced me to a different guy at Strava who eventually introduced me to Mark. And then I had to follow up like 3 times, to get his time. But he's been immensely valuable. I think I reached out to Mark because I see Strava as kind of like this massive hurdle in the past, trying to get people to share their running data in a social sense is, I think, especially at that time, is harder than we think today. And in a similar way, I think trying to get people to journal socially kind of falls pretty close to that. So yeah, get mentors early.
Get mentors early. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. It was great speaking with you. Yeah, I think I'll end it here.
Thank you.